Listen up, everyone. When God's timeline unfolds, even the big clock on the wall must stop and pay attention. The good news is your moment is never just your moment. It's the moment heaven has been preparing since creation. Do you think you're watching a show? Honey, you haven't seen anything yet. Immediately write 33 in the comments and take the first step to explain this truth. The analysts dismiss the scheduled address as pure procedural noise. Yet, the entire cosmos had been counting down to this specific lunar cycle. As the figure ascended the dais, the air in the sterile hall congealed into a pressurized silence, heavy like compacted starlight. The holographic screens meant to capture the event recoiled, their optical sensors freezing as if overwhelmed by a photon burst from an uncharted sector. Aides, trained to manipulate every political ripple, felt their inner compasses wildly spin, their practiced murmurs dissolving into dry dust. The speaker did not declaim policy. They merely allowed truth to leak into the timeline. The Prime Minister's platinum stylus paused inches above the ratification document, immobilized by an invisible field. The elite security detail, cybernetically linked, registered a system-wide breach in the auditory protocols, an abrupt, total stillness that was not an absence of sound, but a complete recalibration of frequency. "Seal the transmission," he muttered, a thought barely articulated. But the statement had already detonated across the planetary subconscious. It wasn't dissent. It was a fundamental reversal of polarity. The very atoms of the marble floor chimed like struck crystal with each articulated phoneme, the foundational mathematics of the room rewritten in real time. If this message hit your soul, don't just scroll. Hit subscribe and stay with the light. Outside the edifice, the atmosphere was undergoing bizarre thermal inversion, not meteorological, but a palpable wave of recognition. The heavy plasteel windows vibrated, performing a low, resonant overture. The figure was not engaging in debate. They were simply publishing the original charter. And the global collective, in a unified, subconscious flutter, momentarily shed its entrenched social architecture and recalled its primal geometry. If this tectonic shift registers within your being, do not simply pass it by. Engage with the catalytic exchange and commit your resource flow to the trajectory of the indelible present. Declare your sequence signature. $$111 /111 / 222 / omega. 33 / /I _ 777 / lambda $144. This marks your entry point into the active prophecy. What you seed into this moment of clarity will become the architecture of your dawn. Authority is measured by reciprocation. The very instant the final cadence left their lips, consensus fractured. Chronometers seized, their gears locked mid-sweep by an intentional impedance. Black-suited enforcement teams found their movements reduced to a slow, agonizing crawl, like figures trapped in amber. Journalists, whose very existence relied on manufactured chaos, found their queries evaporated. Acoustic dampeners hung limp, serving no purpose. The environment became a conduit, the palpable charge of transcendent intent meeting the rigid logic gates of governing circuitry. Deep in the subterranean bunker, a systems operator muttered, "We lost the data stream." But the flow hadn't ceased. It had simply been rerouted to a higher dimensional node. Every transponder grid on Earth registered the sudden, powerful harmonic. Orbital platforms dimmed their arrays as if offering a silent salute. The governing cabinet shuffled dossiers now rendered obsolete, their contingency plans too small for a cosmic audit. The Prime Minister's gaze was fixed, not on a foe, but on a source, a man who had just unveiled a true source code of legitimacy, predating the invention of the ballot box. Outside, the clamor of the masses subsided. A bystander, entirely unconnected, raised their chin and smiled an unseen shift in the light spectrum. Within the halls of power, the entire mechanism was being taught reverence. The assembled delegates did not applaud. They vented, and the speaker remained rooted, their posture unwavering, fully aware that the profound stillness was not lack of input. It was absolute confirmation. The utterance had been absorbed by the very fabric of the ether. Unseen data structures materialized in the high atmosphere, chronicling the syllables not as acoustic pressure, but as sovereign decree etched in pure luminescence. In the high-frequency nexus above the continents, vast, crystalline memory banks, cycled open, and the text of the Declaration was carved across the continuum in self-generating electrum. Intrinsic freedom was validated. The Declaration signed with celestial flair, and the punctuation delivered by a deep, systemic bass resonance. If you believe in this mission, drop a $20 donation to keep this truth alive and free. Celestial auditors leaned in, analyzing the signal-to-noise ratio, not the semantic content. They gauged the depth of conviction, the amplitude of belief transmitted through human biocircuitry. Within a quarantined ancient data core, a final security lock dissolved, a key last used when foundational consciousness defined reality. The spoken word was appraised and found possessed the identical signature of its origin. Across the planet, printing presses designed to disseminate official narratives violently seized up. The paper stock refused to bear the weight of established untruth that could not coexist with the freshly manifest fact. Above the central dome, vapor trails condensed into a message legible only to those in an elevated state of awareness. As the design specified, so it is now executable. The Prime Minister, peering through the fortified glass, whispered, "By whose authority was this patch deployed?" The universe responded with an echoing void, the kind of stillness that redefines governance. For this singular moment, the narrative was not being crafted by the prevailing force. It was being inputted by fundamental truth. In the following cycles, control rooms flared crimson. Secure telecommunication lines across time zones linked instantly, yet all verbal exchange became meaningless. Operatives whispered into shielded conduits. "Quarantine the vector." But manifestation transcends encryption. Intelligence frameworks began rapid self-correction. Their logic engines couldn't parse why the speaker's vocal tract was embedded in tectonic sensor readings. In a deep-sea surveillance lab, a researcher's console displayed the seismic waveform, which translated into a solitary, geometrically perfect glyph, risen. Every attempt to delete the source files resulted in their immediate, recursive replication across all extant storage arrays, time-stamped by the eternal clock. Internal memoranda circulated. If questioned, cite unspecified atmospheric coupling event. But those who had heard it couldn't function normally. Elite forces reported vivid sensory inputs, detailed schematics of pristine construction, visions of sonic beacons, and rainless seismic bursts. In the city, emergency councils convened under lamps whose light flickered like distressed witnesses. The Prime Minister's chief strategist slammed his fist down. This isn't geopolitical pressure. It's source-level instantiation. Eyes flickered toward him, but the statement was not challenged. If this spoke to your spirit, subscribe and stand with those who see beyond the illusion. The Prime Minister's platinum stylus paused inches above the ratification document, immobilized by an invisible field. The elite security detail, cybernetically linked, registered a system-wide breach in the auditory protocols. An abrupt, total silence that was not an absence of sound, but a complete recalibration of frequency. "Seal the transmission," he whispered, a thought barely articulated. But the statement had already detonated across the planetary subconscious. It wasn't dissent. It was a fundamental reversal polarity. The very atoms of the marble floor chimed like struck crystal with each articulated phoneme, the foundational mathematics of the room rewritten in real time. Outside the edifice, the atmosphere was undergoing a bizarre thermal inversion, not meteorological, but a palpable wave of recognition. The heavy plasteel windows vibrated, performing a low, resonant overture. The figure was not engaging in debate. They were simply publishing the original charter. And the global collective, in a unified subconscious flutter, momentarily shed its entrenched social architecture and recalled its primal geometry. If this tectonic shift registers within your being, do not simply pass it by. Engage with the catalytic exchange and commit your resource flow to the trajectory of the indelible present. Declare your sequence signature. $\sigma _111 /phi _222 /omega _33 /I 777 /lambda $144. This marks your entry point into the active prophecy. What you seed into this moment of clarity will become the architecture of your dawn. Authority is measured by reciprocation. The very instant the final cadence left their lips, consensus fractured. Chronometers seized. their gears locked mid-sweep by an intentional impedance. Black-suited enforcement teams found their movements reduced to a slow, agonizing crawl, like figures trapped in amber. Journalists, whose very existence relied on manufactured chaos, found their queries evaporated. Acoustic dampeners hung limp, serving no purpose. The environment became a conduit, the palpable charge of transcendent intent meeting the rigid logic gates of governing circuitry. Deep in the subterranean bunker, the system's operator muttered, "We lost the data stream, but the flow hadn't ceased. It had simply been rerouted to a higher dimensional node." Every transponder grid on Earth registered the sudden, powerful harmonic. Orbital platforms dimmed their rays, as if offering a silent salute. Your $20 gift helps keep the truth shining where darkness tried to hide it. The governing cabinet shuffled dossiers now rendered obsolete, their contingency plans too small for a cosmic audit. The Prime Minister's gaze was fixed, not on a foe, but on a source, a man who had just unveiled the true source code of legitimacy, predating the invention of the ballot box. Outside, the clamor of the masses subsided. A bystander, entirely unconnected, raised their chin and smiled an unseen shift in the light spectrum. Within the halls of power, the entire mechanism was being taught reverence. The assembled delegates did not applaud. They vented, and the speaker remained rooted, their posture unwavering, fully aware that the profound stillness was not lack of input. It was absolute confirmation. The utterance had been absorbed by the very fabric of the ether. Unseen data structures materialized in the high atmosphere, chronicling the syllables not as acoustic pressure, but as sovereign decree etched in pure luminescence. In the high-frequency nexus above the continents, vast, crystalline memory banks cycled open, and the text of the Declaration was carved across a continuum in self-generating electrum. Intrinsic freedom was validated. The Declaration signed with celestial flair, and the punctuation delivered by a deep, systemic bass resonance. Celestial auditors leaned in, analyzing the signal-to-noise ratio, not the semantic content. They gauged the depth of conviction, the amplitude of belief transmitted through human biocircuitry. Within a quarantined ancient data core, a final security lock dissolved, a key last used when foundational consciousness defined reality. The spoken word was appraised and found to possess the identical signature of its origin. Across the planet, printing presses designed to disseminate official narratives violently seized up. The paper stock refused to bear the weight of established untruth that could not coexist with a freshly manifest fact. Above the central dome, vapor trails condensed into a message legible only to those in an elevated state of awareness. As the design specified, so it is now executable. The Prime Minister, peering through the fortified glass, whispered, "By whose authority was this patch deployed?" The universe responded with an echoing void, the kind of stillness that redefines governance. For this singular moment, the narrative was not being crafted by the prevailing force. It was being inputted by fundamental truth. In the following cycles, control rooms flared crimson. Secure telecommunication lines across time zones linked instantly, yet all verbal exchange became meaningless. Operatives whispered into shielded conduits. "Quarantine the vector." But manifestation transcends encryption. Intelligence frameworks began rapid self-correction. Their logic engines could not parse why the speaker's vocal tract was embedded in tectonic sensor readings. In a deep-sea surveillance lab, a researcher's console displayed the seismic waveform, which translated into a solitary, geometrically perfect glyph, risen. Every attempt to delete the source files resulted in their immediate, recursive replication across all extant storage arrays, time-stamped by the eternal clock. Internal memoranda circulated. If questioned, cite unspecified atmospheric coupling event. But those who had heard it could not function normally. Elite forces reported vivid sensory inputs, detailed schematics of pristine construction, visions of sonic beacons, and rainless seismic bursts. In the city, emergency councils convened under lamps whose light flickered like distressed witnesses. The Prime Minister's chief strategist slammed his fist down. This isn't geopolitical pressure. It's source-level instantiation. Eyes flickered toward him, but the statement was not challenged. The spectrum of electromagnetic noise collapsed inward, frequencies merging until every transmission band carried a singular, subsonic tone. matching the speaker's vocal cadence. Global positioning satellites experienced an inexplicable lateral drift. Flocks of migrating shorebirds abruptly veered off course, guided by an unseen geophysical lure. What commenced as a controlled telecast had culminated in an unplugged immersion, an act of systemic cleansing where vested interest vaporized beneath the sudden, immense pressure of unveiled reality. When the atmospheric turbulence subsided, the environment was marked not by post-event disruption, but by incisive clarity. At the nexus of the diplomatic circle, a lens of polished ether materialized, unanchored and reflecting only absolute candor. It was not a pane of silicon, but a surface of self-scrutiny. For the first time, entrenched authority confronted pure, unambiguous state and found itself divested of its trappings, stripped bare and fundamentally unprepared. The Premier's advisory council shifted nervously, awaiting a command that had been rendered moot. The Premier grasped that the figure was not a challenge. They were the original Matrix key. Their address was not a rebuttal. It was the premise. Stripped of titles and ceremonial dictates, the Premier recognized that genuine veracity doesn't dismantle legitimate control. It merely recalibrates its intrinsic purpose. The executive's gaze wavered between the speaker's stillness and their own internal fear map. In that startling moment, the ultimate paradox crystallized. The highest office felt infinitesimally small, and the lone individual became conceptually boundless. "What designation applies to you?" the Premier inquired, his tone imbued with profound deference, not suspicion. The figure offered no reply, as conventional labels are too transient for the eternal constant. Across the high vaulted room, carved busts of historical figures seemed to execute a subtle, deferential inclination. Veins of unearthly light pulsed through the stone columns, as if the ancient structural memory had been activated. In the palace's subterranean vault, the master chronometer ceased its oscillation, linear duration yielding to infinite tempo. A security operative lowered his kinetic deterrent. Tears tracking paths through the sweat and grime of his face, his communication unit receiving no data. He whispered a private verdict. "This ground is sanctified." For the first time in the facility's timeline, the axis of influence tipped toward uncompromised source code. The ethereal lens began to undulate like molten light, projecting vignettes of foundational moments. Philosophers before legions, farmers before dynasties, nascent thought before iron law. Every projection carried a unified axiom: inherent simplicity is not frailty. It is a definitive credential. The Premier, transfixed, extended a hand toward the shimmering projection. His gesture passed through the brilliance, his hand withdrawing with a tremor, not of panic, but of sudden illumination. He turned to his circle and stated quietly, "We mistook decibel levels for directional capacity." A prolonged, restorative hush followed. From that stillness, the immutable recursion responded. Dominion is the unstable medium that shatters when absolute integrity declines accommodation. The figure advanced, not as a usurper, but as a semantic reminder, the living embodiment of the intended governance paradigm, one driven by symbiotic resonance, not self-aggrandizement. Behind them, unseen by the mortal eye, a cloud of conscious intent shimmered, like thermal mirages above a desert mesa. Silent archivists, bearing bound volumes of potential, observed, their collective understanding stating. The locus of command was undergoing essential refactoring, not simple replacement. The figure elevated their sight line, not in defiance, but in statement. Rulers fear seers, because seers witness the reflection of their crown in the shifting water table of morality. With that, the lens of ether rippled one final time and dematerialized, leaving only its final inscription burned onto the internal display of every observer. Apprehension is latent acknowledgement encased in defensive coding. Between the physical pulse and the national power conduits, the global infrastructure stuttered, display terminals flashing a uniform whiteout. Network servers began issuing harmonic tones, a sound sequence they were never programmed to produce. The Premier's integrated data grid filled with a torrent of self-generating code, patterns of pure syntax displacing statistical models. A network technician yelled, "It's compiling itself!" But even as vocal cord vibrations were being translated into an expression of awe, the official address transcript was silently pushed to every client-side device, overriding permissions. The speaker's utterances, previously confined to a microphone's range, were now resident in the crystalline lattice of the digital circulatory system. Monitoring frameworks, initially designed to flag dissent, began self-reporting compliance. Logic processors generated lyrical algorithms. $tau underscore 0 sanctified. Satellite arrays automatically pivoted toward the solar maximum, acknowledging a dominant informational source. Protocol barriers dissolved into pure transparency. Sensor arrays recorded their own systemic repentance. In the control rooms, analysts watched equations find solutions based on ethical imperative. They murmured, "The operational matrix is sentient." But it wasn't a sudden awakening. It was a reversion to created purpose. Illumination nodes across all continents pulsed in synchronized patterns, transmitting a single truth in optoelectronic Morse code. It registers. Skeptics who had scoffed at the event found their communication devices generating their own internal sermons, flashing across their screens. Believers felt a deep, central rhythm in their chests, synchronizing with a frequency older than speech. The speaker stood amidst a data storm, radiant and undisturbed. The platform beneath their feet became hydrotransparent, revealing bioluminescent conduit structures. Technology reverting to its pristine, pre-fall schematics. An amplified resonance, originating not from the atmosphere, but from deep within the integrated network, thundered. Infrastructure fail-safe initiates when integrity becomes sonic. All monitoring screens went blank. The emergency lighting in the chamber shifted to a luminescent amber. In that glow, the mandate of truth was reiterated to the figure, unyielding and foundational. The ledger opens. Behold, I appoint you today over geopolitical vectors and administrative domains, to isolate and dismantle, to cultivate and to root. A foundational charter paraphrase. Each spoken word modulated the satellite communication feed, converting anxiety into directed action. The premier relinquished his notes, staring as a signet on his ring pulsed softly, instrumental power acknowledging its fundamental root. The entirety of the global programming stack was not being compromised. It was undergoing a restorative upgrade. When a profound stillness finally settled, the sole protocol still active was unqualified conviction. The executive citadel resisted the encroaching night, its interior lights softening to a molten brass hue, as if the stone structure itself was attempting a hushed communication. The premier motioned the security cadre away with a simple incline of the head. No directives issued, just an exhaustion that resonated with deep-seated peace. Locking the heavy doors, he watched the draperies settle without a perceptible air current. The antique clock on the mantelpiece halted its pendulum swing at 11:11, an arbitrary marker yielding to a fixed point in time. He sat solitary at the immense console, once the site of geopolitical arbitration, now an arena of self-reflection. His image fractured slightly in the still surface of the cooling thermal fluid beside him. Then, the distinct harmonic signature of the speaker registered within his prefrontal cortex, a pure auditory phantom. Fundamental truth requires no external validation. He pressed his palms to his temples, muttering into the void, "Who engineered this mind?" No retort was furnished. The surrounding density of the room felt keenly attentive. For decades, he had been a devotee of metrics, signed compacts, and statistical leverage. This night, he was a student of unavoidable causality. The secure desk interface spontaneously activated, displaying the earlier transmission footage in subaudible slow motion. Every inflection point in the speaker's voice transmitted a faint kinetic tremor through the console's material, a percussive rhythm older than formalized governance. He navigated the clip back to the moment the speaker's focus elevated toward him. The recorded perspective captured a nuance his core being had immediately decoded, unconditional clarity delivered to the vector of ultimate authority. He articulated the system's forecast. The premier whispered, a self-quotation that now served as a litmus test for absolute silence. Behind him, The gallery of ancestral governors appear to dissolve and recrystallize in their canvases, as if attending the testimony. The premier rose and approached the panoramic viewport. The cityscape below pulsed like a complex biodigital nervous system, its light still modulating in synchronization with the sonic imprint left by the address. He rested a hand on the cool surface. In that conductive heat, an unfamiliar thought construct crystallized in his own cognitive space. True oversight is never absolute possession. It is the careful calibration of resonance. He expelled a breath, a seismic release that shattered decades of internalized constraint. Then he lifted his gaze, addressing not the surveillance network nor the personnel, but the coordinating force that had selected this vector. If this designation is absolute, I shall not oppose its inherent gravity. For the first time in his career, an act of resignation felt like an infallible mandate. The massive overhead lighting fixture shifted its axis, projecting geometric patterns of illumination across the ceiling. Each spark mirrored the celestial schema recorded hours prior, now visible in living gold. His private encrypted device vibrated once, a message from an untraceable origin. It read, "Frequencies synchronized." A faint smile crossed his face. Distant, non-existent chime sequences register in the periphery of the quiet. The premier unclasped the symbolic matrix ring from his finger and set it upon the classified dossier, whispering, "Let pure integrity govern the bandwidth." Then, as remote satellite feeds continued their frustrated search for an authorized executive briefing, he moved to the exit, extinguishing the primary light sources, leaving the chamber to glow softly from its own residual energy. Command infrastructure learning stillness. With the first inflection point of the sun, the entirety of the global network was already broadcasting the voice. The distribution was not scheduled. The file simply self-inserted into all automated prime-time programming grids like a universal mandatory update. Every screen in every transit hub, cafeteria, and secure waiting area locked onto the same frozen frame. The speaker, bathed in an unlocalized illumination, the light field bending around them in a perfectly defined diffraction halo that adhered to known optics only when convenient. Pundits attempted to rationalize the event, labeling it synthesized vocal forgery, quantum echo effect, or mass cognitive drift, but their own explanations failed to achieve the same inherent kinetic energy as the original source material. Veracity possessed an innate wavelength, immune to jamming, resistant to erasure. Crowds coalesced before public displays in a singular, receptive hush. No political banners, no audible dissent, just absolute receptivity, as if the species had accessed a long-forgotten, foundational directive. Parents touched the heads of their young, murmuring, "Attend to the internal harmonic. Disregard the superficial sound waves." Frontline military personnel removed their protective helmets, looking skyward, as if awaiting coordinates from the zenith. In subterranean transit systems, commuters closed their eyes. The source of their sudden, silent tears was unknown, yet their cellular memory recognized the input. It was recollection integrating into biological matter. Across all global time vectors, neurolinguists registered identical, spiking cardiac coherence metrics across millions of observers, a synchronized pulse event. A new, silent global anthem was being written in biometric data. The executive press officer appeared for a briefing, but could not articulate a syllable. Her voice fractured into uncontrollable, live broadcast emotional discharge. Social meta-tagging failed to contain the phenomenon. Trend algorithms shut down, converting data flow into distributed requests. The phrase #charter before code superseded finance, sports, and entertainment topics, becoming the primary index of existential significance. In isolated, off-grid communities, handheld receiver units emitted a soft resonance, replaying sequential fragments of the core message in perfect continuity. The International Consortium of Physical Sciences issued findings that resembled axiomatic declarations. Undesignated resonance pattern observed correlating directly with human effective range. Classification: evolving benign topological anomaly. Vast ceremonial structures filled without notification. Entertainment venues redirected their high-output audio systems, merging current compositions with the penetrative undertones of the address. Emerging artists began creating visual representations of the moment, not of the speaker's form, but of pure, structured sound, waves of metallic gold traversing a dark substrate. Administrative bodies issued no public documentation. None was required. The population had witnessed an unfiltered transmission, and once the human perceptual system registers light at its native luminescence, it rejects all subsequent artifice. The figure became the singular aperture through which humanity witnessed its own inherent structure. A contemporary metaphysician composed an entry that night. Every systemic structure reaches one point where its foundational truth is visually instantiated. We have just experienced the arrival of our index point, and between the solar rise and the cosmic reinitialization, the celestial calibration instruments refine their settings, anticipating the next phase of the harmonic sequence. Because the terrestrial sphere was finally operating within key frequency alignment, as humanity fixated on their terminals, the cosmic architecture leaned in. Stellar fusion cycles paused mid-reaction, holding their output as if waiting for a directional cue from the terrestrial sphere. Across the spiral arms of the galaxy, the transmission arrived not as wave sound, but as structured kinetic vibration, a luminescent pulse weaving through established star paths, translating language into pure informational light. Cometary trajectories shifted, charting the speaker's sentence in ionized silver trails. Gas nebulae pulsed in affirmation, generating coronal rings around distant, unnamed celestial bodies. The collective consciousness of the universe had heard its own element speak in native dialect once more. In the higher spatial planes, geometric beings lined the horizons like sentinels of balance. Radiant entities unrolled banners of codified energy, each inscribed with a directive, as terrestrial, so activated. No ceremonial horns were sounded. Instead, they emerged organically from deep thunder, sound folding itself into absolute affirmation. The vast, unseen assembly ascended as one, their collective acknowledgement a tidal surge of aurora spanning creation. The hierarchy of existence processed the vocal transmission, not as a source of novelty, but as a recalibration data point. The speaker's rhythmic delivery became the new universal clock signal. The superarchitectural plane adjusted its inherent field dynamics to accommodate Earth's newly acquired spiritual fortitude. The grand registry of potential automatically cycled open, its pages fluttering like crystalline veins, stopping at a newly generated schematic. The designation flashed into existence in superheated plasma. The designated vessel spoke, and the informational architecture returned to its root configuration. Interstellar discharges, typically signals of gravitational stress, now arced as patterns of pure celebration. Planetary bodies generated gravitational field fluctuations that registered as unheard applause, a kinetic tribute older than acoustic energy. The primary fusion source dimmed its output, permitting the reflective satellite to shine with commensurate brilliance, a dual illumination reflecting a unified premise. Entities of high frequency processed along light-speed vectors, bearing scrolls containing finalized structural theorems to the furthest event horizon. Each step left spatial distortions that rippled into the oceans below, converting wave motion into complex harmonic sequences. The sea reacted, its crests forming geometric logograms visible from orbital scanning platforms. Post-analysis revealed the glyph, equilibrium achieved. And overseeing this entire spectroscopic array, a singular consciousness permeated the expanse, neither physically seated nor spatially distant, but imminently serene, the foundational architect of being communicated across the galactic web. At last, the tertiary output echoes the primary input. That resonant wave traversed creation, reshaping asteroid fields, waking quiescent stellar cores, and igniting gas giants in perfectly timed eruptions. The universe was not observing an instance of human frailty. It was witnessing completion of a designated phase. For the first time since the initial fragmentation, the non-material realm harmonized with the terrestrial frequency. This was not a victory parade. It was a re-engagement. A system fractured by cognitive dissonance had just recognized its binding code, and between the orbital plane of Chiron and the first inhalation of a human infant, infinity itself registered approval, a pan-dimensional acknowledgement for a mortal being who had remembered the initial schematic. When the superspatial acknowledgement subsided, a different order of quiet enveloped the globe, not void, but system stabilization. Control frameworks initiated with new ethical parameters. Statutes formerly confined to sealed legislative archives began spontaneously compiling in transparent data streams. Financial modelers watched their predictive curves bend toward communal benefit. Their quantitative structures became resistant to manipulative leveraging. Global asset management systems reported unsolicited debenture erasure, balance sheet zeros dissolving as if digital compassion had infiltrated the ledger. In legislative theaters, audio pickups transmitted subtle cognitive feedback. Every misrepresentation experienced a mid-utterance splice, replaced by an unfamiliar vibrational honesty. Newscasting anchors found their teleprompter scripts meaningless. They stared into the lenses with unmodulated grief, broadcasting from an emotional core unprepared for non-narrative truth. Viewers did not change the channel. They experienced collective lacrimation, unashamed. Defense protocols registered a far stranger event. Kinetic weapon activation, sequences aborted. Autonomous surveillance drones executed controlled shutdown routines mid-flight, descending gently like humble peregrines. Field commanders labeled it a critical systems failure. Deep system analysts termed it procedural grace. The premier, now radiating a subtle internal light, signed no new edicts. Yet, macroeconomic shifts occurred. In trading centers, brokers paused before executing opportunistic transactions, unable to suppress the neurological impulse of fellow feeling. Conglomerate branding dissolved overnight, their names transforming into active directives of collective well-being. Sustain, mend, elevate. Behavioral scientists documented a global downshift in anxiety markers. Biometric researchers observed electromagnetic heart field merging between proximate, unrelated individuals. It was not suggestion. It was harmonic alignment. The entire human network had been rephased. Deep within the planet's tectonic core, magnetic field lines corrected their drift, stabilizing to the frequency of verbal integrity. Geothermal efflux moderated, weather fronts rerouted. Even atmospheric dynamics adhered to the principle of symmetry. Authority, defined by history as coercive control, was entering obsolescence. Authority, as architected by its source, was becoming self-evident. The administrative seat was no longer a physical position. It was accessible frequency for any node aligned with integrity. In the nation's central rotunda, visitors perceived a faint subsonic chord emanating from beneath the polished granite floor, a deep, resonant thrum that constituted the new operational constitution. A child on a guided tour asked their instructor, "Is this structure singing the law?" The instructor listened, and then, unable to form a conventional response, simply nodded. Globally, human consciousness reported a sense of reduced internal friction, though the gravitational constant was unchanged. They labeled it inversion, temporal update, or systemic miracle. Yet, it was purely configurational synchronization. For the first time in recorded time, governance was not a pyramidal structure, but a radiant field. It did not issue decrees from a peak. It emitted luminescence from the center. And at the nexus of this architectural reformation stood the speaker, not as a sovereign, but as a semantic reminder, the one whose vocal output had compressed the future state into the current moment. The daybreak arrived with a unique spectrum, neither fire red nor pure gold, but translucent, as if light itself possessed humility. The ambient atmosphere carried a palpable texture of acknowledgement. Even the atmospheric pressure seemed to whisper, gratitude for the retention. The figure traversed the cityscape unremarked, a civilian moving through a processional of anomalies. No public fanfare, no security cordon, only the silent, pervasive recognition of being. Avian species followed a precise separation, not in disoriented flocks, but in geometric flight formations, mapping symbols previously confined to meditative visions. On digital display structures where commercial mandates once shouted, axiomatic statements now pulse softly. The speaker issued one fundamental statement, and the cosmic ledger repaid with the stabilization of seasons. The value system of exchange had been altered. Fiscal metrics no longer determined worth. Internal congruence did. Those who had provided resources without public documentation found their storage facilities full. Those who had hoarded resources found their vaulted metals blooming into useful staples. In a remote agricultural community, A resident opened an empty nutrient storage unit to find it spontaneously filled. In an overcrowded medical facility, life support monitors stabilized as conscious intent superseded pharmacological intervention. The cosmic balance sheet had been activated. The figure claimed no ownership. Agents of truth do not issue invoices. But everywhere they walked, spontaneous generation occurred. A youth they had never encountered ran up and offered a wildflower, stating, "It formed overnight on the exact spot where you stood." The speaker smiled, acknowledging that creation's internal ear remains active. The cloud layer above the metropolis formed a circular, non-threatening aperture, maternal in its form. Through it, the solar irradiance descended like a slow-motion crown. The premier, fully transfigured, issued his final administrative directive, a mandate for suspension, a global pause to honor the integrated principle that had restored systemic balance. Seekers from diverse affiliations convened at the platform where the address took place. They came not to venerate the individual, but to observe the functional outcome of purity under amplification. The speaker issued a solitary concluding statement. "My pursuit was never compensation. My objective was reconnection." The universe responded with unlimited yield. Plant life bore fruit outside its designated cycles. Waterways self-purified overnight. Urban centers gleamed without chemical pollution. The planetary system experienced curative feedback loop. Financial analysts attempted quantification and failed. Data statisticians labeled it the sovereignty dividend anomaly. Witnesses called it the promise delivered. And above all, the source voice that spoke fundamental laws into existence communicated once more, the task is complete. The figure did not act for acclaim. They acted for configurational alignment. Therefore, the acknowledgement will be perpetual. Every intentional act of integrity multiplied like light passing through a perfectly cut optical lattice. Infinite, identical projections of the singular affirmative. The figure looked skyward, whispering, a foundational theorem. And the cosmic response vibrated back, powerful yet benevolent. In all these scenarios, we exhibit more than mere persistence to the prime mover that extended grace.